deeply for our people and for the land that sustains us. Today, I want to talk to you about the noble, proud agrarian tradition of Black people. Toni Morrison said, if there is a book that you need to read that hasn't been written, go and write it. And I believe that this book, right, both the physical book and the metaphysical book of our people's noble, dignified contribution to agriculture is being written right now by us. So first, let's start by calling in the support of our ancestors. I know we've been doing that all day, but I want to get in on it too, and particularly want to call in Susie Boyd. She's my grandma's grandma's grandma, and she, like so many women in the Dahomey region of West Africa, before being forced to board transatlantic slave ships, had that audacious hope to braid her seeds of rice, molokia, levant, cotton, okra into her hair, because she believed against odds in a future of tilling and reaping on soil, and she believed that we, her descendants, would exist to inherit that seed. And so I call her, and I invite you to also call the ancestors who had foresight for you. Take a breath, say their names into the space, welcome them to be there to support you. I also think it's absolutely essential, right, that we acknowledge and walk in solidarity with the original people of the lands upon which we stand. Whether we are voluntary or involuntary settlers, we still benefit from settler privilege and have an obligation around rematriation. I am here on Mohican territory. I feel very blessed to be in new friendship with some members of the Stockbridge Munsee Mohican Nation who have educated us about their Trail of Tears in the 1800s, who've educated us about the native seeds and plants that need to be here on the land, and who've helped us to know the best way to act in solidarity. And I also want to name and shout out my team, right? Because none of us is an island. We're all part of an ecosystem. And if it wasn't for Larissa, Cheryl, Kiani, Justin, Jonah, Naima, I just wouldn't be able to be here right now with you, because it's all got to get done, right? The crops got to get harvested. Those sheep need their water. We need to make sure the deliveries go out. And so it's that team that makes it possible. Soulfire Farm started back in 2010 with this idea, this hypothesis that to get free, we really need to feed ourselves. My partner, Jonah, and I were living in the south end of Albany with our young children, Nashima and Emmett. This is a neighborhood under food apartheid. And despite our strong efforts to get fresh food on the table, there was just no supermarket, there was no farmer's market, no community garden plots available to us. And so the only way we could get that food was to join a very overpriced subscription program called the CSA and walk over 2 miles, piling those vegetables on top of the kids in the stroller, in order to have our soup, our tomatoes, our okra, and so forth. And when our neighbors found out that we both knew how to farm, they started saying, like, well, when are you going to start the farm for the people? When will you start the farm for us? And so we really built Soulfire out of that vision of feeding ourselves as Black and brown and multiracial families. So the very first program we opened in 2010 was Solidarity Shares, which people affectionately term Netflix for vegetables. It's a subscription program, but the kicker is that you only pay what you can afford. So folks are getting a doorstep delivery of fresh herbs, vegetables, fruits, eggs, pasture-raised meats, right, at whatever price they can afford, down to zero. And these, again, are neighborhoods that are overlooked in the current industrial racial capitalism that we find ourselves in. And, Solidarity Shares is still going strong. We especially center refugee communities, people impacted by incarceration, people impacted by the pandemic. And it changed over time, though, because folks who were getting the food started to be like, well, we have our young people, our children are getting harassed by the police. They don't have anything to do in the summertime. Can you create something for them? We started getting phone calls from folks across the nation saying, is it really true that you are, a family of color and that you are here on the land doing this thing? Can I come and learn from you? So bit by bit, we started expanding into the realm of education and training. We started our youth program. We started our youth camp called Liberation on Land. We started to have our BIPOC Fire, that's Black, Indigenous, people of color, farming in relationship with earth. That's a week-long training where folks come live on the farm with us and learn. We started having apprenticeships that last the entire year, hiring our apprentices to join our staff team, right? And so bit by bit, we were expanding into this idea that we really are this returning generation of Black and brown farmers that are finding our way back to land after centuries of being expunged from the land, being traumatized by the land. And from there, our graduates are saying to us, well, this is cute that we know how to farm, but we don't have any land, we don't have any capital. And so this piece around systems change came into being as well, where we started to say, you know, we need to form a land trust, we need to form some finance vehicles, we need to make sure we change the laws. And that organizing is not just national, it's also international. We're part of Via Campesina, Haitian peasant movement. We're organizing in Vieques. We're organizing in Ghana, West Africa, to try to uplift the voices of peasant farmers against this onslaught from industrial ag. So that's a little bit of background, but really what I want to talk to you about is, you know, what is this legacy of our ancestors that we're building on right now? Because I mentioned to you that our ancestors braided seeds into their hair, right? The gourd, the sorrel, the African spice, basil, pelargonium, cola nuts, okra, sesame, black-eyed pea, eggplant, melon, kale, etc. This is what came with us, and this is part of our heritage. But what a lot of folks don't know is that along with those braids of seeds, we also have braids of agricultural wisdom. Pretty much anything you can think of that has anything to do with farming, our ancestors contributed to, right? So for example, right, let's just think about soil testing. If anyone has ever taken some soil in your hands and done like a texture by feel where you're making a ball, then you're making a ribbon to see, that comes out of the Yoruba people, understanding how to look at a soil and just with our five senses determine what it needs in order to be healthy. And we use these techniques on our farm. When we first got to our land, it was so degraded, you couldn't even stick a shovel into it. It was too hard. The topsoil was too shallow. You just hit subsoil. And over the years, right, of applying Afro-Indigenous technologies, you now can stick your whole hand into that soil. The organic matter is back in there, right? What are those technologies? Well, let's talk about Cleopatra. All the way back in 59 BCE, when she got started, she realized how sacred the earthworm was. She realized the earthworm's castings were responsible for the fertility in the Nile River Delta. So she put out a law that said, if you kill an earthworm, I'm gonna put you to death. Now, mind you, I'm not down with state violence, so I'm not advocating the death penalty for anything, but I would say that it was a very powerful testament that a ruler in that time would see the earthworm as so sacred that she had a whole cadre of priests whose full-time study was dedicated to the habits of these earthworms, right? And you can, the USDA scientists went down in the 1940s, took soil cores, and they were like, damn, it's 10 times more worm castings here than in surrounding time periods, which is a testament to that protection and creation of habitat for the earthworms, the beginning of vermicomposting, right? The other side of the continent, you go to Liberia, you go to Ghana, the women are making African dark earth. African dark earth is a type of super rich pyrogenic compost that's a combination of bone char, kitchen scraps, you know, residue from the fields, and this stuff is able to just hold nutrients like nothing else. Now, they believe that every generation is responsible for contributing to that layer of compost. And so you can read the soil layers like the rings of a tree to determine how old the community is, because every single generation has contributed a layer to that soil. Moving from there, right? A lot of people will talk about the way our indigenous ancestors farmed in very derogatory terms. They'll say, oh, they're not sustainable. They were doing slash and burn and so forth. You probably heard that term. But slash and burn is actually a derogatory term for a sustainable practice called swidden agriculture. The way it basically works is that you farm in a particular area in the forest that's been cleared, right, for a couple of years. And when that soil gets tired, you're moving to a new area. And the entire rotation takes a full generation in human life, 20 to 30 years. So by the time you get back to where you started and you're ready to cut and burn again, that whole forest has regrown. And what does the forest do, right? The forest is able to put down its leaf litter. It's able to pull nutrients up from deep, deep in the earth and put them on top. It's able to hold the soil in place. And so that system actually sequesters carbon. It builds habitat. The problem is, when you start to take away land from indigenous people, when the colonizers come and take the land, then you're forced to use a smaller and smaller area. And then that rotation goes from 20 or 30 years down to 10, down to 5, down to 2. That's not sustainable, right? So when we talk about crop rotation, we need to pay homage to our indigenous ancestors who actually started crop rotation with the forest as the cover crop. Y'all probably heard of permaculture, right? I will put forth that permaculture isn't even a real thing, because It is actually a collection of Turtle Island and African indigenous farming practices that have just been repackaged, stolen, and commodified by mostly college educated white men. But permaculture, right? When you break it down, one of those most important technologies that gets celebrated is this idea of perennial polyculture, which is a fancy way of saying when you plant a lot of trees and shrubs and perennial herbs together in a way that's self-sustaining. You don't have to replant it every year. You don't have to fertilize it. We do that all over our farm. We love it. We love it. Our Jardin Lakou is popping. But when you go to West Africa, when you go to the Black Caribbean, so I'm Haitian and we spent a lot of time in Haiti, you will see them doing this. You will see the moringa trees together with the lemon trees. You have the vetiver and the rosso surrounding. You have the vegetable crops. And when we spend time in Haiti, we actually get a chance to support the building of these nurseries and the building of the restoration of these degraded hillsides using the perennial polycultures, which we again call in Haiti Jardin Lakou. Another technology that our ancestors helped contribute is the idea of Fanya, which in Kiswahili means throw it upwards. It's a way of saying when the soil erodes down the hillside, what you can basically do is dig it up, put it back up, and make like a staircase or a terrace where you have wood or stone blocking the soil steps in place, right? The indigenous people of what is now central Mexico also developed this technology around the same time as our African ancestors. And on these terraces or fanyaju, you can put stabilizing crops like your trees and your herbs, and it permanently protects that hillside from erosion. Transplanting, right? We all do it, especially those of us who live in the cold Northeast where the growing season is just way too short. So we actually have to start our seeds in trays inside a protected place like a greenhouse before we put them out into the field. And the first documentation of transplanting actually comes from the rice farmers of West Africa, the Mende and the Wolof people who would, create these nurseries for their rice seedlings. And when the rice was big enough, they'd transplant those seedlings out to the paddies when they were strong enough and fortified enough to make it on their own. Even livestock, for those of you who are down with raising animals as part of an integrated holistic system, the idea of rotational grazing, of moving your livestock from one place to another, especially after your crops are done. So like, for example, at our farm, right? There's going to be some pest insects in a season that build up and they burrow into the soil to make it through the winter. But we can prevent that cycle from repeating by getting some chickens into the field in late fall and the winter time to scratch up and dig up and eat all those bugs. And then they put down their manure and that soil is ready to go next year. So this idea, particularly of rotating cattle through the rice paddies, this comes from our Central African ancestors. And for those of you who like to raise chickens, I'm kind of obsessed with chickens. Black people have a very special relation with chickens, which has a dubious beginning in some ways, because in Virginia, the laws prohibited enslaved Africans from owning most livestock. So no cows, no geese, no sheep, no turkeys, no pigs, because, that's how they're trying to keep us down. But chickens weren't mentioned in the laws. So Black farmers became very, very, very good at raising chickens. And a lot of the varieties of chicken that we celebrate, the types of housing we use, the types of grazing that we do, feed, comes from that knowledge of our enslaved ancestors who were raising chickens as their own project. Anyone ever made a raised bed? We're obsessed with them because raised beds really help if you have any type of flooding conditions or just wet conditions. They're going to drain that soil right out. They let the soil warm up. They let it be a little crumbly. But raised beds, we can trace back to the Ovambo people in what is now Namibia. So they would make these mounds, right? Mounds of soil to plant in, and then they would go ahead and add in cattle urine and muck from the swamps and manure and termite ash to fortify those beds. And when the colonizers tried to take away their soil, they fought them. They said, these raised beds have been generations of investment and you can't replace that just by moving us to a new spot. And some of the technologies too that our ancestors contribute aren't just in terms of the science of agriculture, they also are the social science of agriculture. So if you all ever had a volunteer day or a work party, This comes out of the Dokwe of the Dahomey region. It comes out of the Kombit of the Caribbean. These are both ways of saying collective work and mutual aid. So rather than a wage labor system, what our ancestors and people contribute is this idea of labor exchange. So I'm going to be over to your house this week planting beans, and you're going to come to my house next week and plant my beans, and then our harvest is staggered, and we're going to have some parties while we do that harvest too. The host is responsible for the food and the bands. Things like the credit union, for all of you who bank at a credit union, the progenitor of that is the susu of Caribbean women, before that in West Africa. And the idea with the susu is that we all put in a certain amount of money at a regular interval, and then when it's your turn, you get to take out a chunk, and that chunk can be used to buy a cow, it can be used for your, the tools that you need on your farm, or to thatch your market stall. And in that way, we are collectivizing our wealth rather than hoarding our wealth. A lot of the tools that we use, from the hoe to the sprinkler to the refrigerated truck, right? These tools were invented by African and African diasporic farmers. Food preservation is on my mind this time of year, so I'm always like fermenting my vegetables, I'm drying things, I'm trying to freeze things up for winter. And a lot of the technologies that we have around food preservation also come from African farmers. For example, in Eastern Burundi, they have a way of storing tomatoes in ash in the ground so that they are still fresh 6 months later. And whether you are talking about smoking, drying, fermentation, all of these things actually came with us as knowledge braided into our ancestors' hair. I don't know if y'all ever called the extension agent to ask a question about a sick animal or a pest insect or something that wouldn't grow, but the fact that we have these agricultural experts that are willing to come to us and help us, this idea actually came out of Tuskegee University in Alabama, Black farming institution. So it started out with the Booker T. Washington Agricultural School on Wheels, a mule in a cart, which later graduated to a truck. But their basic strategy is they would go out to the county, the rural areas, because they knew that the farmers could not always come to the university to get that information. They would find the most dilapidated, busted farm and fix it up, right? They would go ahead and take care of those animals, prune the trees, plant some cover crops, and then they would turn that farm into the demonstration site for the region. So people will come from far and wide to see, and they'd move to the next county. And that's how agricultural extension started. Organic agriculture itself, right? Shout out to Dr. George Washington Carver, because if it wasn't for him in the late 1800s, this is like 2 generations before Rodale, who claims to be the father of organic, right? We had Dr. George Washington Carver, who could listen to plants, who could listen to soil, saying we need to stop mining the soils by planting cotton year after year after year. Instead, we should be putting some beans into the soil, because beans have this beautiful relationship and friendship with a bacteria called the rhizobial bacteria that lets them capture nitrogen from the air and put it down into the soil, restoring the soil. We need to be mulching, we need to be composting, we need to be paying attention to the soil as the source of life and health. And he convinced a whole generation of farmers to basically be organic, late 1800s, early 1900s. Shout out to Dr. George Washington Carver. Also to Tuskegee, we got to shout out Booker T. Watley, because if y'all ever heard of farm to table, and I mean all things farm to table, whether it's the CSA, that's a community supported agriculture, which is like when you're a member of a farm and then you get a weekly share. If you all ever have done like pick your own, where you go to someone's farm and pay them to pick apples and pumpkins, right? This comes from Watley's really ingenious idea, where he realized that city folks miss the country, and city folks would actually be willing to pay for proximity to farmers. They would come and pick their own food, and there'd be an experience of connection in that would make it viable for the farmer to stay small and to do diversified horticulture instead of these big monocrops. So that's why we got the type of farms that we have today, right? When we talk about, our co-ops and collectives, Black community is expert at co-ops. Fannie Lou Hamer is just one example of that. She was building off of this yearning that our people had at the end of the Civil War, when 40 acres and a mule was just a broken promise. So our ancestors were saying, and I quote, "We feel it is very important that we obtain homes, owning our own shelters and the ground, that we may raise fruit trees concerning which our children can say, these are our fruit trees. Right? So Fannie Lou Hamer, building off that energy, she started the Freedom Farm Cooperative in the 60s, which was a safe haven for sharecroppers who had the audacity to try to register to vote and were kicked off of the plantation for that audacity. 70 families, cooperative ownership, able to provide food and burial fees and scholarship fees for their members, and catalyzing a whole generation of sustainable farmers. I mean, Mama Hamer said, if you have 400 quarts of greens and gumbo soup canned for the winter, no one can push you around or tell you what to say or do. If you have nothing canned for the winter, as soon as they close down those grocery stores, you're going to put down your ballot and go crawling on your knees for food for your children. So fundamentally, if we want to be free, we have to have the means of production in our own hands. Right? Shout out to Dorothy and Philip Barker, my elders, right, who were instrumental in starting food hubs in this country. We used to just call them church sheds, because after church, the farmers would just pile in whatever extra watermelons they had, extra pumpkins and so forth, and a big truck would take it up to a sister church in Chicago or Detroit, right, or Boston. And this developed into the idea of food hubs, which is when farmers put their produce and other crops together in order to access bigger markets, a very popular idea right now. Even the lunch programs in our school, right? We have the Black Panthers to thank for that, because they were feeding 20,000 children a day in Oakland, free breakfast, every single morning, free breakfast. And that became the model for these meal programs at no cost that we now have for our children in many of our public schools. The last example that I want to share with you is one that's very personal to me, because my own child, Nishima, who's now a high school graduate, ready to fly the nest. When she was just a baby, we were urban farmers in Worcester, Massachusetts, and she came along and did all the things with me that a farmer's child would do. But when we took her to her 1-year checkup at the doctor, it turned out that she had elevated blood lead levels, and that was from contact with the soil. The soil was poison. Legacy of lead paints, of emissions from leaded gasoline had resulted in this toxification. And of course, we did everything we needed to do to take care of our child, but we want to make sure that other children didn't suffer this same hardship as she did. And so what we were up to was to go around testing the soil in Worcester and figuring out ways to clean it up. And it turns out that the EPA sets a safe limit of 400 parts per million in the soil for lead, and we were finding levels as high as 11,000 parts per million, which is like toxic Superfund site. And part of the solution is a little flower called the Pelargonium in Latin, or the scented geranium, its common name. It is a hyperaccumulator. It actually pulls lead out of the soil into its tissues, and then you can dispose of it. Now, don't try this at home without proper training, because you can cause some problems. But the cool thing about Pelargonium, it's actually an African flower. It's a flower whose seeds came over, right, in those lower holds of slave ships with our ancestors. And at the time, lead wasn't even a thing, right, in the human realm. It's an element deep in the earth. But I feel like that flower knew that it would need to be of service to its grandchildren, and so it came with us. Now, when I was living in Ghana, West Africa in my early 20s, been back several times since, most recently in February to visit my elders, the Queen Mothers, in Kroba land, they had a lot of fun asking me questions about, what life is like in the United States. And one of the things that they just couldn't believe about us, they would say, Leah, or they call me Amidede, is it really true that in the US a farmer is going to put a seed in the ground and they're not going to pray or sing or dance or pour libation or even say thank you to the earth, and then they're going to expect the seed to grow? Now, what is that, right? And I had to admit it was true. They said, that is why you're all sick. You're all sick because you treat the earth like a commodity and not like a relative, right? So a big part, in addition to these technologies that we have brought over, we need to remember the psycho-spiritual technologies as well, of how to be the true younger siblings of creation, right? The plants and animals, those are our older brothers and sisters, our older siblings. And so we need to make sure that we have the proper level of humility and deference to those beings. So if our folks have done all this for agriculture, why on earth are we only representing 1.5% of the farmers, right? Why on earth don't we all know about this? And I'll say there's 5 basic things that are impeding our progress as a people, right? Because the entire US food system is really built on stolen lands and exploited labor, and we are impacted by that. We are part of that, right? So the first thing is, of course, the land, right? The land was stolen from indigenous people, and then for many generations, other folks of color were prevented from owning land, or if we did attempt to own land, were violently and brutally expelled from the land. Talking about discrimination by the federal government, the USDA not giving loans, talking about the white caps and the Ku Klux Klan literally lynching folks and burning down houses and pushing people off their land. I'm talking about retirement funds like TIAA exploiting air property to try to snatch up the land, right? So the descendants of European colonizers control almost all the land today, 98% of the land, and that is no accident of history. And without land, we really don't have any stake whatsoever in our futures. The second thing I mentioned was stolen labor, right? So the US food system was very much built on the backs of our ancestors, but it didn't end with the Emancipation Proclamation, right? We went through a whole series of reincarnations of neo-slavery with the Black Codes, with convict leasing, and then later with the migrant guest worker program, which exploited Filipino workers, Chinese workers, workers from Mexico, from Jamaica. And still today, over 85% of the labor that's done on farms is done by Black and brown folks, right? Yet only just under 3% of farms are owned and managed by people of color combined. And so what we're looking at is a huge racial disparity in terms of who controls and has power in the food system versus who is actually laboring and making the food system happen. And of course, farm workers are not protected under the law. In the 1930s, when we had for the first time the Fair Labor Standards Act and all these labor laws around the right to overtime pay, the right to unionize, child labor protections, farm workers were excluded because they were and are people of color. And we still haven't updated that legislation. There's a really powerful quote by white accomplice Wendell Berry, who really ties together this idea of labor and environment. So I'm going to read it to you because I think it hits on something that isn't often understood. It goes like this. The white man, preoccupied with the abstractions of the economic exploitation and ownership of the land, necessarily has lived on the country as a destructive force, an ecological catastrophe, because he assigned the hand labor and in that the possibility of intimate knowledge of the land to a people he considered racially inferior. In thus debasing labor, he destroyed the possibility of meaningful contact with the earth. He was literally blinded by his presuppositions and prejudices. Because he did not know the land, it was inevitable that he would squander its natural bounty, deplete its richness, corrupt and pollute it, or destroy it altogether. The history of the white man's use of the earth in America is a scandal. And it's true, right? Because there will be a mirror in terms of a reflection in terms of how it is that we treat one another as human siblings and how we treat our siblings in the non-human realm. So it's no surprise that the third thing I'll mention that gets in the way of us flourishing as Black farmers is the wanton destruction of the earth herself. Industrial agriculture is destroying the planet. It is a leading driver of greenhouse gas emissions. It is a leading driver of water withdrawals, of habitat loss, of biodiversity loss, right? And so we know how to farm in a way that actually makes the earth better. You know, here at Soulfire, using the Afro-Indigenous practices, we're able to put carbon back into the earth. We're able to increase the number of pollinators, right? Increase the number of native species. That is the way. But industrial agriculture has prioritized profits in the short term, right, over the abundance and sustainability for 7 generations to come. The fourth thing that gets in our way is food apartheid. Not a food desert, mind you. A desert is a natural phenomenon, but there is nothing natural about your zip code being the #1 determiner of your life expectancy. There's nothing natural, right, about Black and brown folks being more likely to suffer from hunger, diabetes, heart disease, cancer, kidney failure, all these diet-related illnesses, because of a whole legacy of redlining, of housing discrimination, right, of other types of obstacles in our way of building wealth and security. And so I don't know about you, but when I am not well, when I am hungry, I'm certainly not feeling like organizing. I'm not feeling like farming. And so for us to be nourished in body is what makes possible our building of the future we want to see. And the fifth and final thing that I think stands in our way is the trauma itself. You know, as Chris Bolden Newsom, Black farmer in Philly, says, the land was the scene of the crime. But I would add, she was never the criminal, right? The land is actually the source of our strength. And while that sharecropping and the tenant farming and the slavery and lynchings, all of those horrible things that happened and are happening to our ancestors, were really, it really made sense that they would flee the red clays of Georgia to come to the streets of the urban north and the west, right, to get away from all that. It makes sense. And I also believe we left a piece of our culture and souls behind in that soil that our generation, the returning generation, is going back to pick up. And so we have an opportunity to let the earth heal us, to let the land reclaim us, right? We have an opportunity to really start to define our relationship to land, not just by the few hundred years of oppression, but by the thousands of years of dignified and noble connection to the land. So I think the question is, how do we show respect for the Black agrarian tradition, right? How do we carry on the legacy of our ancestors who braided seeds, knowledge, and wisdom into their hair? And the answer is very simple, because it's already happening, right? Just the presenters on this powerful, you know, event today, the organizers of this event, you can see that Black and Indigenous-led organizations, collectives, formations, individuals are doing the work. And all that is really needed is to believe and invest in it. So for folks who have some time to give, some money to give, some land to give, some connections, power, platform, like advocacy, energy, give it over to the people who are heeding the call back to the earth, and support all of us in doing what is our ancestral right to do, right? Please support the National Black Food and Justice Alliance, support SAFON, support Via Campesina, BUGS, the Federation of Southern Cooperatives, Happily Natural, Malcolm X Grassroots Movement, the Black Farmer Funds, the Native Land Conservancy, the Heal Food Alliance. Support these collectives and formations in doing what it is that we were born to do, and fulfilling this destiny of leading our people back to the earth. So I leave you with the question, what seed are you going to plant after today, And there is, well, before I end with one of my favorite poems, I just want to say, if you want to be in touch with Soulfire Farm, please do. Our website is soulfirefarm.org. Our handle on everything except TikTok, we're not there yet, is Soulfire Farm, all one word, and we would love to collab with you. So I'll end with some words by Pablo Neruda, which are translated from Spanish to English. It goes like this. Pardon me if when I want to tell the story of my life, it's the land I talk about. This is the land. It grows in your blood and you grow. If it dies in your blood, you die out. Ashe, amen, ayibobo. Peace, everyone.